Hey guys, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna Bemis Palmer Museum in York, Nebraska. For today's video, we're going to be talking about Charleston, Nebraska. If you haven't heard of it, don't feel bad, you're not the only one. So, Charleston was originally platted in 1887 by the Pioneer Town Site Company. It was about 5 miles southwest of York. So it was named after Charles or Charlie McLeod. He came to York in 1877. He was very active in local politics and banking and business. He was also a purchasing agent for the railroad, so they chose to name it after him. That McLeod family is pretty important in our town history as well. So this particular railroad line supposedly ran from Hastings to Blair, and it was owned by the Chicago Northwestern. They had this, they called it the Little Train, and it went basically from Hastings to Fremont one day and then back to Hastings the next day, and it carried passengers, mail, and there was also the Blue Valley Creamery in Hastings, and it carried cream back and forth from the farmers there. So Charleston seems to have collapsed in like the 1940s. Basically, the railroad stopped sending stuff through in 1942 and everybody just abandoned ship around the same time. The post office closed that year. The school closed in 1947 due to lack of kids. It's said that the last buildings in all of Charleston were a railroad depot, a coal shed, there was a elevator there, the auto elevator, and a few smaller buildings, and then the last of those was demolished in August of 1984. And after that, there's really nothing. So fun facts about Charleston. At the peak of Charleston's history, so the largest, right, there were about 50 people that lived there and like 30 houses involved. The post office was inside the general store, and at that general store you could get about anything that you needed. There was even a dance hall on the second floor, so multi-purpose. At one point, it was so popular with grain that there were actually two different elevators, that auto elevator included. There were also two churches. There was one that was Christian and one that was Methodist. Some cool figures involved. Walter Malmquist. So he was born in Charleston, and he's got some cool baseball information on him. So he played for the York team, which was the Prohibitionist in like the 1910s area. He was in his 20s at the time, and he played shortstop. And it's said that he led the Nebraska State League in hitting in 1913 with a 447 average, which is pretty impressive. After he got tired of baseball, he moved back to that Charleston area and helped his family out with farming. Another guy linked to sports, who we have talked about in a past Mondays at the Museum episode, was a guy named Dave Erb. He went on to win the Kentucky Derby. So he was born in Hall County, but he was raised in Charleston, and he was born in like 1923. So he went on to be a jockey and a trainer of race horses. He started riding really young and actually competed all around Nebraska in like 1938. After that, he moved to California in the late 30s, early 40s kind of time-wise. So his first big race was June 11th, 1955. It was at a race called the Californian Stakes. It was at Hollywood Park Racetrack. So he was actually filling in. He wasn't even supposed to race at this time, but this guy named Willie Shoemaker, who was the regular rider, he was on a 5-day suspension for reasons unknown. And so they chose Dave to ride in his place, and not only did he win, but he broke the world record for that length of track, and they're like, we got to get this guy his own horse. So later that year, he started to ride a horse named Swoon Sun, and he won like a ton of races. So it said that this Swoon Sun, he rode for all but one of his 22 career stake wins, right? During this time, he competed mostly in Chicago and Kentucky, which leads us to 1956. So he was on a colt named Needles. They called it Needles because he was very sickly as a foal, and he used to get shots all the time, and that's why they called him Needles. So true underdog. He and Dave Erb went on to win the Kentucky Derby in 1956, and it was not easy at all, obviously, because it's Kentucky Derby, but also because at one point in the race he was 16th, so he had to come from all the way back in 16th to win it. He also won the Belmont Stakes that year. However, he got second in the Preakness, so he couldn't complete the American Triple Crown. He was just that close, missed it by that much. He retired from being a jockey in 1960, moved on to training racehorses instead, but he was entered into the Nebraska Racing Hall of Fame in 1972, which I think is awesome. He passed away actually really recently too, 2019. He was 95. He was just 1 week shy of his 96th birthday. So some cool people and some interesting facts about Charleston. I'm going to show you now our Charleston area of our History of York County display. Just beware, small town, not many years in existence, so small collection, but still plenty to show you today. All right, so here is our Charleston area. It is right next to the Lushton items. First off, we have a wedding dress. Now this is from 1908. Interesting naming wise. So basically, Alma Swanson married a guy named Clinton Swan, so went from Swanson to Swan. And this is February 12, 1908, at her house, which was near Charleston. And this dress is handmade, and it's in incredible shape for 1908. Clinton was a rooming house worker here in York, and they had 2 sons and a daughter, and they moved to California, which is where they are buried now. And speaking of moving to California, here we have this magazine. So it's the Equicurian magazine, July 2013 version, and it is on Dave Erb. So here's a picture of him after he won the Kentucky Derby in 1956, and in this, they're talking to him and interviewing him, and it's really interesting because at one point he said he never broke a single bone, which I think is just ridiculous because I don't know how much you guys know about racing horses, but like you're thrown a lot. So to not break any of them is quite the feat. But a really interesting article there. We also have this newspaper clipping. So last of abandoned towns demolished. This was from July 31st, 1984. So they are in the act of demoing there. And like I said, the last building was down in August as of 1984. And then also in our Charleston area, we have the scale. So this was to weigh the sample for moisture, and it was used at one of those Charleston elevators. I'm not sure which one, but one of them there. So not a ton of items in that area, but plenty of stories to go with them. So that was very brief history of Charleston, which unfortunately did last a very brief time, but that's okay. Still plenty of interesting stories. So tune in next week. We're going to be talking about Thayer, Nebraska. I'll give you the brief history and then show you the Thayer area that we have in our collection. We'll see you next week.